Thank you, and it's nice to see you all sticking around in my hometown. Unlike Dr. Watanabe, I drove 15 minutes to get here this morning. Nonetheless, I'm excited to have this opportunity to speak, and I thank you for that. I have no disclosures to share with you. I'm sure you've all seen the big blue bear outside this building on your way to the airport. You can recognize as another large blue animal, a little less friendly looking. But I want to give props to whoever animated the blue bear last night at the sing-off. That was a true masterpiece. I had to take some pictures. So Colorado is a great place to work and practice. We've been known to be #1 in many avenues and areas. Certainly our really low BMI average helps my hernia practice tremendously. We've been known for pioneering unique policies, including marijuana legislation. And at times, we're even #1 in sports. It's been a while, though. When it comes to surgical smoke legislation, though, we were not #1. That distinction goes to Rhode Island. They enacted legislation for smoke evacuation in 2018. Shortly after, though, in 2019, colleagues of mine who work at my hospital were actively involved with our Capitol building right across the way, trying to enact our own state law. And I was able to get some insight from them, anecdotally, of course. Nonetheless, it did culminate in this House bill. And I've read the entire House bill. But to get there was not an easy process. At the time, there were several companies working on their own smoke evacuators, and the hospital consortium, which was the opponent who didn't want to necessarily enact this bill, mandated some cost analyses, which are a little hard to do when certain companies are buying others and no one can really tell you what it's going to cost to mandate smoke evacuators. A few folks were there to discuss how they got HPV in their respiratory system, and they were told to provide specific genetic proof that that's exactly how they got it, which is a really hard ask and also somewhat frustrating to hear. Nonetheless, they were able to overcome these obstacles and enact the legislation, and the entire House bill that I've read is right here. Kind of looks like one of those op notes you might get from the outside hospital, some squiggly signatures and a couple paragraphs. The most important part is this. It just says here in our state that any licensed hospital or outpatient surgical center that's using these devices that create plume are going to have some sort of management system. Not really specific. The AORN, which is actually headquartered right here in Denver, has now a recognition system. We are a silver level system at University of Colorado. You can check your own facility right here on their website. And they have many useful resources. I'll mention a few. It's not just Colorado, as some of the audience members are aware. This is where we stand right now as of 2022. With several states that have already enacted legislation mandating smoke evacuation. This map was taken off the AORN website and also from an Ethicon brochure. Many have legislation underway, and then, of course, the blank states, I imagine, will soon follow, particularly among this pandemic. But beyond state legislation, there's many governing bodies and regulatory bodies that have their own strong opinions and strong statements, many of that are backed with data. So we're going to go through these. As I mentioned, AORN, headquartered right here in Denver. They are probably the best wealth of resources you can get. If you're in a state, you're trying to enact this legislation, they have toolkits that'll educate you. What I'm reading about other states right now is that AORN's right there with them, like they were in our state at the Capitol building. Of course, they have a big stake in this. It's not just the surgeons, it's the entire perioperative staff. The American National Standards Institute, something I haven't heard of before, but their mission statement is to enhance global competitiveness of U.S. companies by promoting and facilitating voluntary consensus standards. So it doesn't sound like they have a heavy hammer to swing, but nonetheless, they recognize airborne contaminants and highly recommend and help enforce that contaminants are controlled with use of smoke evacuation devices. We saw a slide, I believe, earlier in a talk about the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which is part of the DHHS, and they have also released their position for decades now, requesting appropriate room ventilation, which is a huge part of it, perhaps outdated with HEPA filter, now ULPA filter, as we'll see in another statement. is recommended. You need to have a specific capture velocity. So if you are a surgeon interested in opening your own outpatient surgical center, you're going to need those specs. And then, of course, we've already heard you need to be within 5 centimeters of the smoke source if you're going to follow it with a Yankauer with inline filters. And those filters and all the associated tubing, by the way, have to be handled as if they are infectious. OSHA, we've all heard of. They have also a stake in this game. They recognize that lasers and electrosurgical plume can contain toxic components, and they therefore mandate removal of atmospheric contaminants with accepted engineering controls and local ventilation. Again, we're missing some details of their degree of requirements. The international, so we're extending beyond our country's borders. International Federation of Perioperative Nurses also released guidelines regarding this topic in July of 2018, so before the pandemic, recognizing once again smoke particles can be dangerous, identifying as a workplace safety hazard, and then requesting respiratory protection, standard precautions, and ventilation and ULPA filters in this case. And of course, we've seen in more detail the SAGES guidelines, particularly pertinent among the pandemic, but they're so easily accessible and so useful either when you're on call or when you're designing your surgical center. Nonetheless, we're all paying attention now with COVID on ways we can mitigate those risks and minimize smoke. So at University of Colorado, I asked, because one of the components of my title was the impact of these policies. And we've already heard it's illegal to not use these things, but I've never seen a cop come in and arrest a surgeon. What they actually did when I asked gently, has anybody gotten in trouble for violating these standards? They said, you know, we just took every single non-smoke evacuator pencil out of all the packets, and now they're all smoke evacuators. And every laparoscopy packet has the smoke evacuator. You really can't avoid it, and that's actually pretty genius. I know some people initially didn't like the smoke evacuator pencils. I'm kind of one of them, perhaps. They can be loud. They don't always work the way they're supposed to. I was a little against the promotional posters I remember seeing about being in the ORs, like snorting 17 cigarettes. That level of danger has been debunked with better studies, but we still know there's a danger, and especially among a pandemic. I'm all on board. And so in summary, there's several states, maybe yours is next, have enacted legislation recognizing it as an issue. Several organizations, including international ones, have policies and guidelines, and especially among a pandemic, we should all be paying close attention and adhering to these guidelines. Many companies have their own educational toolkits that sort of go right with their product that you can learn more from. I would say that smoke may be useful in some situations if you're trying to get away from a bad guy in an old video game, or if you have an ugly drummer that you want to hide, sure. But in the operating room, no useful use for smoke. So we appreciate your attention to this important topic, and I hope you enjoyed your stay here in Denver.